And as we approach 4 p.m. here on the East Coast and 1 p.m. for those of you watching from the West Coast, we want to welcome you to CBS News 24/7 as we cover this breaking story with Judge Chutkan in Washington, D.C. unsealing Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's election interference case against former President Donald Trump. We're sifting through the case, the specifics, the allegations he's making against former President Donald Trump. And he says, despite the Supreme Court's ruling that presidents cannot be prosecuted for official acts, Donald Trump's effort to subvert the will of the people in 2020 was not an official act and a personal act that included deceit and fraud of the American people.
And the very beginning of this document is really about that question of deceit for the American people, because we are talking with Rebecca Roife about some of the public forward-facing things that the former president said, sowing questions of fraud, of instability in the democratic process in the public, while we see privately, according to this document from Jack Smith, that he had a private lunch on November 12th with Pence, in which Pence reiterated that he needs to recognize that the process is over. A November 23rd phone call in which the defendant, that being the former president, said to the vice president that the defendant's private attorney, Trump's own attorney, was not optimistic about the election challenges, meaning that what Trump was hearing and what he was discussing in his private conversations was that there was not that he did not win the election, according to Jack Smith. But what he was saying in public was that he did win the election, that this was fraudulent, and that was the big lie, what people are referring to as the big lie. And that was the criminal fraud that Jack Smith is referring to. So given all this, given as we are sorting through now what is 165 pages that has been unsealed, though it is heavily redacted, Rebecca, I want to know, because people are going to be wondering about the timing of this. Certainly, given how close we are to an election, there are some people who feel like it should have been presented earlier. There are going to be some people who feel like this is all political. What do you make of the timing?
There is a huge question with everything that this judge does, that the decision is going to be seen by something like half the public as a, interference in the election. Politically spilling this information before the election, is not the role of a judge. And then on the other side, people who feel like this is, just the justice system working fairly and treating everyone as if they are not above the law. And, how should it go? I mean, I think the best possible way for her to conduct her case is as she would with any other person. But unfortunately, it just in this kind of high charged, politically important case, it's impossible for her to do that. So, this decision is definitely going to be perceived as a kind of effort to, affect the election. But she has no choice but to rule on the motions that are before her. So there are two sides to this story, and it's hard to really sort out. And that's unfortunate because it does leave half the public feeling some great doubt about the legitimacy of this court, and that's troubling.
Rebecca Roife is our legal contributor, helping us digest this breaking news of Jack Smith's case against former President Donald Trump being unsealed moments ago in the election interference case. We also have Derek Muller with us, a professor of law for Notre Dame, who's joining us to understand what this means. And Derek, I want to ask you a more pointed question as we're getting a better sense of what the case is. According to what Jack Smith is laying out, it wasn't just that former President Donald Trump was making public statements sowing doubt about the results of the election, but a section with the note of B here says that the defendant knew his claims of outcome-determinative fraud were false, and then he details some of the evidence that supports that in his view. And he also goes on to say the defendant aimed deceit at the targeted states, we're talking swing states here, to alter their ascertainment and appointment of electors. We're still sifting through this 100-plus document, but why would those points be important for Smith to make if he aimed to win this case against Trump?
Right. So there's a lot happening in this document. But remember, this document is directly a response to the Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus United States. Trump versus United States says the president is absolutely immune for certain kinds of official conduct, the core constitutional responsibility. But other things, such as at the periphery of his official duties, he can be found liable or criminally responsible if the prosecutor can rebut that presumption and explain why it doesn't infringe on core executive functions, explain why it's private conduct, in addition to any private conduct. So the first half of this document is a lot of facts, but the second half is really engaging with what the Supreme Court just held. And the point of this document, in point after point, is to say, look, for all this behavior, it was either Trump's private actions or its actions designed at overturning results in his private capacity as a candidate, whatever it might be. It has nothing to do with his official responsibility as president of the United States. So the whole document is designed to separate those official acts at the core of your constitutional responsibility and other private acts for which you can be held criminally liable.
And Derek, as we're trying to digest all of this and seeing so much of what we've seen both in public and described elsewhere, pulled together in this one document, trying to understand then that Jack Smith has almost two fronts that he is on the attack on, or on the defensive on, I guess, because he has to both present his case about why he believes that, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the former president is, in fact, guilty of these allegations, these crimes that he's laid out, but also why the Supreme Court's very broad understanding of presidential immunity doesn't apply here. Given what you've read, do you think that this, on that latter point, do you think that that is well articulated? And please remind our viewers a little bit more about how we got to this point.
Sure. So Trump versus United States comes up out of this case, and Donald Trump is arguing, listen, I should have some immunity for some of my conduct as president of the United States. And Jack Smith is saying, no, you shouldn't. And the court sort of divides it and says, there are some things at the core of your responsibility as president: vetoing legislation, pardoning individuals, speaking with the attorney general who is in your cabinet. Those things are sort of core executive functions, and you are absolutely immune. And the Supreme Court really took only one thing off the table, those sort of conversations or pressure he put on the attorney general. Everything else, pressuring Mike Pence, pressuring electors, contacting officials in the states, making speeches from the ellipse, tweeting out things, the court hedged. The Supreme Court said, listen, there's evidence that cuts both ways. We're not going to decide it now. We're going to send it back and let you decide. That's actually a strong hint that the Supreme Court didn't have consensus. It had consensus on one point, on this sort of notion that there's immunity for speaking to the attorney general, but not on all these other things. So Jack Smith is taking that cue and he's going point by point and saying this was private conduct. And even if it wasn't, if you think it's presumptively official conduct, we can overcome that presumption and explain why it doesn't intrude upon core executive functions. We can explain why it's really falls more on the private activity side of the line. So it's a response to the Supreme Court on that point to say, you left the door open, Supreme Court. Now we're going back and explaining why we can walk right through that door.
Derek, on that, I want to ask you a follow-up question, because since that door is left open and there isn't complete clarity on that point, is it likely that what Judge Chutkan ultimately decides will end up being appealed again to the Supreme Court, and that even after this is determined, that it isn't over?
Absolutely. I think we'll see another appeal out of this decision. I mean, the point is that when the court takes a case, it says, we think that the lower court got the law wrong. And we send it back so that the lower court can resolve it. And maybe if they have the right law, they'll use the facts and sort of get things correct. So we'll see what happens, right? I think there's no question that the district court here, it rejected the immunity argument, it rejected Trump's argument. It seems likely that she's going to reject that argument again. She's going to look at what the Supreme Court said, saying, okay, you left the door open. I'm going to carefully walk through charge by charge, fact by fact, and explain why I think he can still be held liable, but still be held criminally responsible. But at the same time, of course, once you say that he can be held responsible again, we're going to see another round of appeals, and we're going to see another challenge to say, no, you got what the Supreme Court said wrong. So the court punts this question for another day, but that means that it might come back to them another day.
And perhaps that's why there's so much depth and specificity in these pages, especially when you look at the footnotes. They're citing tweets, statements, and private statements from people who are redacted. Derek Muller, stand by for us as we continue to cover this breaking story of the unsealed case from Jack Smith of Donald Trump and what he says is the election interference case of 2020. We want to bring in CBS News Justice Department reporter Rob Laguerre. He follows this on a regular basis. I'm not sure, Rob, how much you've been able to sift through when it comes to the specifics. What happened in Georgia jumps out at me, but I'm wondering from your point of view as someone who's intimately aware of the details, what jumps out at you?
Yeah, good afternoon to you all, and thanks for having me. So, right, I mean, first, the specificity really jumps out here. As you all have been saying, this is 165 pages of detail, and this is the most fulsome look that we are getting at the evidence that Special Counsel Jack Smith argues he and his team of investigators have amassed throughout this entire process. And so you'll remember, this investigation dates back years. Special Counsel Jack Smith was appointed almost 2 years ago, and this case was charged over a year ago. And so this evidence has been amassed over a long period of time. And a few things that quickly jump out as we're sifting through this is first, right off the bat, as you all have been talking about, Jack Smith lays out his argument. He says this is a purely, at its core, private campaign allegation. And so he says, taking that Supreme Court ruling, arguing this was not a presidential duty of Donald Trump, but according to prosecutors, these were actions that he allegedly took as a private citizen, as a candidate for office. And so continuing through that, we see here right off the bat in the beginning, his allies saying he's going to declare victory, according to prosecutors, in the weeks and months leading up to the election, regardless of how the election actually turns out. And according to prosecutors, Trump said allegedly that he told allies that he was going to get out in front of this, declare victory before anybody was even declared a victor in the 2020 presidential election, to stave off any of that, any claims that he had lost the election. And so, that is something that sticks out. And then, as you rightly said, Errol, the specificity in each case with the swing states that Trump and his legal team targeted. A lot of this was already public. We do know, based on some of the January 6th committee hearings, Trump's second impeachment, and then the subsequent fallout from that, and over the last few years, we have a lot of this information already out there. But what is new is some of these redacted names of people, private citizens, who were part of this alleged effort and who were victims of this alleged effort. And so really, this is, again, as we said, the first detailed look at the evidence that Special Counsel Jack Smith has amassed.
Rob, as I'm going through all of this, and I'm thinking about the multiple legal challenges that the president is facing, I'm thinking for our viewers, it would be helpful, given your role as one of our justice reporters, to help remind them of where in the pantheon of legal problems that the former president is confronting, where this falls, where the timeline for this case versus some of the others that have been postponed. If you could talk us through some of these legal troubles that our viewers are seeing on their screen right now.
Yeah, sure. So the legal landscape that the former president has faced and is facing continues to change, and it's one in which he and his legal team have successfully put off a lot of these legal challenges and cases that were brought against him. Special Counsel Jack Smith was seen as really the biggest legal threat to the former president, and now one of those cases in Florida, the classified documents case, that's been dismissed and is currently being appealed. That's a long process, and so that's something that the former president's legal team successfully got dismissed in federal court in Florida. Judge Eileen Cannon ruled Special Counsel Jack Smith was not lawfully appointed. The Justice Department is appealing that, but that has been pushed off and delayed. This case was brought after that. This case was seen as, again, another looming threat to the former president in his legal challenges. But again, the former president's legal team was able to appeal this case all the way to the Supreme Court to get a ruling that then is now forcing Judge Tanya Chutkan to go back through the evidence in the case bit by bit to see what evidence complies and could be included in the case, complying with the Supreme Court's decision, and which needs to be excluded. And so this is a really complex legal question that she is being forced to grapple with, and that Jack Smith's prosecutors now have to pony up and show the evidence that they have to allow this evidence to be interpreted. And so, this is a really, other than the Supreme Court precedent here, a lot of this back and forth and the motions being filed, this is standard for a lot of complex legal cases. What is not standard, however, are the allegations that are being put forth here. And so these two federal cases, the first one I mentioned that was dismissed, this one that is moving forward slowly, are the federal cases the former president faces. He also faces an ongoing yet delayed case in Georgia at the state level with the Georgia State Attorney Fani Willis, and so that is another case tied to a lot of the allegations here, but it's one in which is also delayed, and so none of these cases are going to go to trial before the election, which was a goal of the former president's legal team. And so here we're hashing out this 165-page legal document, and we're just trying to learn more, but none of this is going to get to trial before the election.
We're listening to the analysis of Rob Legary, our justice reporter, who helps us understand the specifics of so many legal cases, specifically as it now pertains to former President Donald Trump. If you're joining us, this is the breaking news event as Jack Smith's case against Trump revised since the Supreme Court's ruling that presidents are immune from acts they take officially has now been unsealed. Let's bring in CBS News legal contributor and former Manhattan prosecutor Rebecca Roiphe. Rebecca, you've been able to get a bit of a brief break and a speed read through these documents. There are some specifics that jump out to me, but based on your point of view, what's noteworthy?
I'm working my way through the document, and there are a couple of things. I think there's one point that is, I think, important from a legal standpoint, and then another one from a factual standpoint. So from a legal standpoint, as Rob was suggesting, there is a lot about private citizens working with the former president. And the legal import of that is that what Jack Smith is trying to show here is that the former president was acting as a candidate, not as a president. This is what he needs to show in order to establish or hope to establish that this is not covered by presidential immunity. It's in that third group where there is no immunity because it was simply private acts. So the fact that there were a number of private parties who were involved with the former president is significant from a legal standpoint. From a factual standpoint, relatedly, it is, I think, important, and I'm not sure the extent to which it was formally known, how much this started prior to the election. And so I think some of those facts are important in that they show that the former president had this plan before there was even an election that he could assume was rigged. And given the fact that it started before that, and he was having discussions with people prior to the election, extensive discussions in which he was talking about his plan and in which he refused to say that he would necessarily peacefully turn over the presidency, that does shed light on the whole conspiracy. And if the jury were to believe that, I think that that would be a key piece of the puzzle, because it suggests that this was, a well thought out plan that had multiple components, which is essentially what Jack Smith is trying to show.
It's interesting, as I'm reading through this, Rebecca, Jack Smith is going through state by state. Yeah. And he's giving examples of private conversations that the defendant, Donald Trump, then president at the time, was having with campaign officials, with people on the ground, election officials, and they are saying to him, what you have is inaccurate information. What you're saying is inaccurate. And he's talking to officials in Georgia. And I'm quoting here, when the defendant claimed that 5,000 dead people had voted in Georgia, redacted name, said, well, Mr. President, the challenge you have is the data you have is wrong. when the defendant claimed that thousands of out-of-state voters had cast ballots. Redacted person responded, they're not accurate. And that it sounds like, according to Jack Smith, repeatedly he was being told from people that were on his team, right, that were Republicans or were, in the case of Arizona, that they're talking about somebody from the campaign who told him, hey, look, Mr. President, there's this rumor going around that a substantial number of non-citizens voting in Arizona. That's false. That all of these people on Trump's team were saying this stuff is false. Don't listen to this. And yet he continued to perpetuate it in a public manner. Why is that crucial for Jack Smith's case? Why does that show the criminal intent that he's hoping to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt?
Yes. So all of these are extremely important because essentially the fraud that is alleged here requires that the former president have the intent to undermine the will of the voters and to interfere with Congress. And so in order to establish that intent, what these paragraphs are doing are showing that he had this state of mind because he was told multiple times that this election, there was no outcome changing fraud in the election. And therefore, when he said the opposite publicly, and when he did things to try to change the outcome of these different states' elections, that was not just him, in his job as president, sort of trying to oversee and make sure there was a fair election. It was rather the acts of a desperate man trying to steal, a desperate man, right? Not president, a desperate private citizen in his role as a candidate trying to steal this election. Now, it doesn't necessarily establish that. There are other defenses that he could use, but that is very strong evidence. And I think that's why there is so much of it in this motion.
And we should emphasize former President Donald Trump denies these claims. He says he's innocent and did not break the law at all. Rebecca Roife, stay close with us as we continue to sift through this. We want to bring back in Derek Muller, professor of law from Notre Dame. And Derek, one thing I want to do with you is actually speak about something our viewers might find a bit more tangible, a news item they may remember, which is inside these documents as it pertains to Georgia. There was an allegation back in 2020 of suitcases filled with ballots that had somehow been misplaced. This is a debunked claim, but Jack Smith specifies in these pages Donald Trump's effort to push the misinformation anyway. I'll just quickly read a portion so our viewers can be reminded. It says the defendant had early notice his claims of fraud in Georgia were false. He still claimed that a large number of dead people had voted. He was told that was false. He continued to press the claim anyway, including in a press appearance. He then went on to orchestrate a presentation to a judiciary subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate, advancing it, and all of these redacted names had spoken to the defendant for almost 20 minutes. At the hearing, that same person arranged for co-conspirators and agents to repeat the false dead voter claim. The claim was so patently false, Jack Smith says, that everyone around the defendant knew it, including hearing the chief of staff redacted, exchanging text messages on their personal phones, confirming that a campaign attorney, redacted, had verified the redacted claim of more than 10,000 dead votes found. And this went on to kind of speak to the State Farm arena, in which there was actually footage of election workers moving a kind of post office box of votes that turned into a conspiracy that those votes were actually stolen. Why is it important for Smith to construct his case in this way, with dates and with specific examples, in order to prove his claim?
Right. So remember, we're looking not just at his claim, where Jack Smith is bringing a prosecution. He has lots of facts. We know a lot of these facts already. What Smith is trying to rebut is the claim of immunity, right? That Trump is immune from prosecution because he was president at the time. So Smith's motivation in detailing, for instance, all those details from Georgia is to come back to the court and say, look, what Donald Trump is doing here is what candidates do. It's what private citizens do. It's what private parties do. Because how in the world can you say the president of the United States has any role in talking to ordinary people in Georgia or even the state officials in Georgia in how Georgia runs its elections? What role does the president have in that? Because if it's an official responsibility, and I imagine former President Trump will come back and say, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm upholding my Article 2 oath to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. He's going to say that it's official conduct. Smith's motivation is to say this is not official conduct. This is private conduct. This is what private candidates do when they're trying to win elections or when they're trying to subvert the rule of law. So all of these details about Georgia and elsewhere, it's a lot of facts, a lot of details that'll be useful for prosecution, but they're all trying to turn on private details, private facts. These are not White House conversations with officials. These are side conversations. They're conversations with state officials. They're conversations with private figures. A lot of details to shore up the notion for Smith that there's no presumption of immunity for Trump in these cases. These are private acts, and therefore he can be prosecuted.
Let me follow up with you on that, Derek, because all the time we hear the White House press briefing, some member of the press asking a question about the campaign, and we hear Karine Jean-Pierre say, I'll refer that to the campaigns. I can't talk about that. And there is supposed to be this very clear line about what you can do when you're in the White House running for election, and how much campaigning you're allowed to do, which is you're not supposed to be doing it. So when you talk to us about what that bright line is supposed to be and how that then plays with the argument that presumably Trump's defense is going to be making, which is that he is ultimately responsible for making sure that the country, that the Constitution is upheld. And if he believes that there is widespread fraud in our democratic process, that as the president, it is his duty and obligation to make sure that is rooted out and exposed.
Yeah, so on the first
Hatch Act
point, when we're thinking about this notion that it's just this question of presidential immunity and trying to address this question of the campaign versus the executive, we try to draw that line, but it's messy. And I think we've seen lots of allegations of Hatch Act violations. We see lots of things that look fuzzy when you're using Air Force One and speaking about an economic stimulus to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania,
Right.
During a campaign. It can look a little bit messy. And a reason why I think the Supreme Court punted this issue, it sends it back to the lower court to sort out the facts, to figure out where that line is. And that's what Jack Smith's brief here is trying to do. It's trying to say all of these acts are on the private side of the line. And then to the second point that you raised, thinking about this executive power and saying we want to enforce the laws, the president has the authority to enforce laws, but it's enforcing federal laws. And so what are those federal laws? Typically, if we think about voter fraud, those are matters of state concern. They're state matters. There are some federal matters, and he talked with his attorney general about that. And Attorney General Barr said, I investigated, I couldn't find anything. By the way, those things aren't really in this complaint or in this memo, because the Supreme Court said those conversations are supposed to be off limits. So there's going to be this separation of just generally saying I'm supposed to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And the specific allegations say, no, you're the president. What are your specific responsibilities that Congress has given you, that the Constitution has given you? Let's try to drill down on those and don't just speak generally. And this is Smith's effort to say the vast majority of what Trump did was private conduct. Now we'll see how Trump responds in his own reply and response to try to insist that some of this was official conduct.
And just for our viewers who may not be aware of what the Hatch Act is, and Lana is right, we hear the press secretary mention that when she gets thrown questions that are political in nature, it limits political activities of federal employees and local government employees who work in connection with federally funded programs. Its purpose is to ensure that federal programs are administered in a nonpartisan fashion and to protect federal employees from political coercion in the workplace. So that's, I think, why you referenced that as potentially being at play here, while not referenced specifically. Derek, stay close for us. We want to bring back in Rob Legary, who now has had his own time to look through some of the pages. And Rob, perhaps you can help us understand in what fashion, from your point of view, Jack Smith has adjusted his case against Trump, considering the Supreme Court's ruling on presidential immunity.
Sure. Well, first, I mean, to answer that question, we want to go back to the superseding indictment that was issued earlier this year. A lot of the conduct related to the official acts that the Supreme Court ruled Trump was immune from, meaning he couldn't be charged for the conduct. They're out of the indictment, and they're out of this. Legal brief. Matters related to the Justice Department and other conversations that investigators alleged Trump had with White House officials, national security advisors, individuals within the White House with whom Trump would interact on a regular basis as part of his role as president. That appears, now again, I haven't read all this, a lot of that appears to be gone from this brief, and it's not included in the original superseding indictment that Trump now faces and to which he's pleaded not guilty. Also notable in this is that there is an emphasis here on January 6th itself. The indictment and the superseding indictment focus a lot, as does this brief, on the alternate slate of electors that investigators allege the former president and his supporters tried to amass leading up to January 6th. But what we see here as well is what the special counsel alleges Trump's actions during January 6th. Prosecutors allege here that the former president was on Twitter watching Fox News and issuing some incendiary statements that they said prompted the mob toward the Capitol on January 6th. And notably, investigators reveal that, according to their evidence, on the evening of January 6th, they say, quote, the defendant and an unnamed co-conspirator attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol, close quote. They say that Trump and his co-conspirators tried to call senators and attempted to further delay the certification even after January 6th, at the evening after the violence at the Capitol had subsided. And so these are just some new details that we're getting that prosecutors allege promote and bolster their claim that what Trump was doing throughout January 6th and leading up to it was not as a president, but as a candidate for office, as a private citizen.
And Rob, just as you're speaking, I want to make viewers aware that we're looking now at live footage of President Biden, I believe, arriving in North Carolina to tour some of the storm damage left by Helene. He is there in an effort to send a signal to residents in this part of the Southeast that the federal government is doing what it can to provide aid and to get services to those who need it. The press, which is part of the traveling pool with the president, I can almost guarantee is trying to yell questions at President Biden now about this unsealed indictment. You know, if that happens and if he speaks to the press at all, we will, of course, bring that to you. We may just wait and see if he does approach the press in a way that we will be able to hear him. But, Rob, as we continue to watch President Biden, I believe he's, in an effort to avoid violations of the Hatch Act, not commented publicly on his position about these cases against former President Trump. Fact check me on that.
Sure. I can't speak exactly to what the what the current president has said in totality about this case, but what I can tell you is that the Justice Department, Attorney General Merrick Garland, have religiously avoided commenting on this case, arguing that doing so would be inappropriate. You'll remember Jack Smith was appointed almost 2 years ago as special counsel because Merrick Garland said, the Attorney General Merrick Garland said that he wanted to avoid any allegations or any even appearances that anything that was being done was politically motivated. And so he appointed Jack Smith to be an independent special counsel who would operate within the Justice Department, but as his own investigator, with his own set of investigators, as others have operated in the past. And so, this case has now been in the courts for over a year. And since then, and particularly since then, but also leading up to it, the Attorney General Merrick Garland, members of the administration, have not sought to comment on the case beyond what they say in public filings. The Justice Department has strict norms and rules about commenting on cases once they are tried, especially once they are brought. Once indictments, once charges are filed, they do not go within the four corners of the charging documents. And so Merrick Garland, the Justice Department, has stood by these charges, has stood by the special counsel, and has said that this case will move forward. But other than that, we haven't seen much from the Justice Department and from the Attorney General as to any commentary or comments on this case.
And just to button that up, we saw President Biden get in his motorcade. He didn't take questions and is continuing his tour now of Raleigh, North Carolina.